welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to the last breakout session of the day. I've done this talk a few times and I've always run out of time for questions at the end. So I've tried to cut out a few things. It's probably going to be a 10-minute talk now with lots of time for questions, but we'll see how we go. So firstly, thank you to the sponsors who make these sorts of events possible. I've done this at 3 DDDs and it's always because of sponsorships, so that's great. And if everyone, I'm sure you've seen this slide 1,000 times today as well, but don't forget to finish off your sponsor bingo card so that you can win prizes. And I have that Lego set. It's very fun to build, so hopefully that's the one that you get. So yeah, my talk is documentation for developers, but it's been rebranded for today only to Developers Do Documentation. Hopefully. So this slide, hopefully it's visible from the back. I didn't realise I'd be in the world's longest room, but yeah. So this is a rough overview of what we're going to go through. Don't worry too much about the details, but just so you have an idea as we're getting through things, there's probably about 7 topics that we're going to cover today, and hopefully at the end of that, people won't be so scared of attempting documentation. So just a little bit about myself. I'm a principal consultant at 6Pivot, practice director, a CTO on a side project. I do lots of tech stuff. I've worked in a range of organisations from small startups to large enterprises, and I think that's what gives me some qualifications to talk, or I've felt the pain about documentation, so that's why I'm here to talk about it today. I also like going away for holidays and doing interesting adventures, which may not seem relevant, but documentation is actually the key to how you can take leave without stressing. Or at least that's my sales pitch and my justification. So let's get into it. Why should we document things? There's many reasons. The main, I've listed a bunch of reasons, but the main thing I'm going to come back to for why we should document things is to help team on board, to remove yourself, and there were some other talks today that talked around the topic of, people embedding their knowledge in the team, or, that is their power in the team. So the reason you should document stuff is so that you're not a key risk in that team. Also, that no one's a key risk in the team, so that you can take holidays, so that you can get promotions. If you're the key person and new people can't join the project, you can never leave. So for me, that's a really selfish reason, but it's a good one. Plus all these other reasons. One of the other things for when new team members are joining a project that I think is a really good benefit or reason why we should document is the decisions of the past, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the future, but you can waste a lot of time when a new person joins the team and you have to justify everything all over again. So I'll talk a bit more about that in future. But the main reason is developers who don't document stuff are being jerks. And the reason that I say that is if you hold everything in your mind or you write code and then just disappear, the next person who comes along, which is possibly you in 6 months' time, is going to have to go through this painful process to figure out what on earth this project does. If you clone a Git repo and it's just index.ts and that's it, then you've got to waste time and you're not doing valuable, business valuable stuff. You get no satisfaction out of that day. So, yeah, above all other things, don't be a jerk to your teammates or yourself. So if there's all these reasons why we should be documenting, why aren't we doing it? And I think historically it has been a boring process. I've been in the industry for a couple of decades now, and I've worked in those enterprises where you get given the Word template and please document the things. And that's super boring. And the reason why it's super boring is because it gets you out of the flow of day-to-day work as a software developer. If you have to close Visual Studio or Writer or whatever and jump into Word and fight with formatting and weird templates, it's a grind. And so you don't do it. I think the other one for me is that probably the last point is that perfect being the enemy of done. Everyone thinks that you need perfect documentation. And my point here about some of the techniques I'll share is a bunch of bullet points in a README or in a Git repo is better than a Word document with nothing in it. So if you can put a couple of bullet points, and I don't know who saw Rebecca's talk earlier, minimum viable programmer, the MVP approach to documentation is better than not doing anything at all. And the other 2 points around diagramming tools and licensing are a little bit related. I've found in small and large organizations, if you need to purchase a license to create documentation or create a diagram, you won't do it. There's too much friction. In small organizations, it can be because $25, well, and everything is a subscription now, so $25 a month is too much to pay for a diagramming tool that we don't use all the time. In a large organization, you have to talk to your team lead, who talks to their manager, who talks to the procurement team. Like, no one's doing that to get a $25 a month Visio license either. So these are all the reasons why we're not doing the simple things. So then, yeah, just recap on some of the stuff I've already said. Some of the traditional approaches are things like Word documents, Confluence, and wikis. Everyone probably knows all these things, and diagramming in Visio and Draw.io, or I guess the other classic, which was when we worked in offices, whiteboarding, taking photos and putting them into Confluence, which is possibly a better approach than some of these others. So these are the traditional approaches, and I'd like to propose an alternative, which is much more developer friendly. It is to take the ideas from infrastructure as code and approach documentation as code, or at least documentation as text, which I guess all documentation is, but documentation and diagrams as text. The idea is to separate the content or the structure of the documents from the rendering of the documents. And with things like Word, I feel like often you can get into Word and people spend more time, and I see this with a lot of my colleagues, not the two that are here, but other colleagues, about bullet points. You know, oh, the bullet points aren't all lined up. What? Who cares? Like, this is not the point of this documentation. A new developer is not going to care. So through what I'm about to share, it's focusing more on the content of the message than the rendering and display of it. Again, about my hatred for paying for licenses, and it's not because I don't want to pay for them, it's just the friction that they cause. So if we can do things using tooling and or open source tooling that we already have access to, that's something I'd like to aim for. Versioning, or even better, pull requests. If we can use our development processes to ensure that our documentation goes through the same rigor that everything else does, that would be awesome. And then back to my MVP approach is to keep it simple and start small and then get more complicated as you go. So hopefully these words are okay at the back. I won't read through them all, but I've kind of covered a lot of this already, the pros and cons. Sorry. I think probably the main cons I'll cover here is the learning curve. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today are new domain-specific languages or new markup languages that people might not have come across. And obviously with that, there's a learning curve. I don't think it's too bad. And the second point is that if you're working with non-technical team, and it could even be non-developers, so you might have BAs who are quite technical but they're not used to writing code, that can cause friction in this process. I think it can be overcome, and if we work, that's why it's with developers and friends, if we work together we can help each other get through that hurdle. I don't think it's too big. And then the other two problems are more around scale. So if you've got a couple of repositories or a couple of projects, this stuff works really well. If you've got 1,000, it can start to become a problem where you've got documentation spread through 1,000 repos. How do you find stuff? But those are solvable problems. We solve those every day with GitHub and things like that. So I'm going to try and weave this into a little bit of a story, or imagine if sort of story. So as I mentioned, I work as a consultant. We often join new projects, or we acquire a new client and they give us a couple of repos, or they want help with this. You know, our web app's not working well, or we want help to develop some new features. Clone down the repo. That's great. And then, you get index.html or whatever it might be. No idea how to get started. Like, what framework is this using? I'm a developer, how do I begin? So imagine that, and then imagine that across 5 clients and, a handful of projects on each client. It gets to be a pain. So we experience this all the time, and we like to leave things better than we found them. So where do we get started? So the first thing is, and this is back to that big 7 bullet point thing I had. So first of all, day one, what is this thing? I've cloned down this repo, or I've gone looking in GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket or whatever, and I've found a repo in somewhere. So what am I even looking at? What does it do? Or have I got the right repo that I'm about to start working on? So I think most people who've worked in development will have come across, we've worked in repos. Most things have readmes these days. Often they're the default one that just says, sample, whatever it might be, node project, but it's actually a .NET project. So that's not helpful. But so I would say this is the first starting point. Put in a good README so that at least people know what they're looking at. It's a quick intro. Use a template, and I think I've added some cool animations to this. Yes. So there are some tools around that will help you fill in the steps. I think the default READMEs are kind of okay, but they're not great. So this one has a bunch of things. It's kind of for open source projects. Who's the author? What's your LinkedIn profile and stuff like that? Maybe not useful. But it's ChatGPT time now. So I was like, I wonder if I could just ask ChatGPT to write me a template for the specific project I'm working on. Well, not specific, but React Native. What are the titles I should have? So be lazy and cheat. And it came up with this outline for the README. So then I could just fill in the blanks, the headings, introduction, getting started, how to test it, where to get more help next, or Google for examples. The other thing is, if you're working on internal projects at an organization, I think the best example of good READMEs is actually to go to GitHub and find a good open source project, because open source projects have to have good documentation, otherwise no one will look at them. So that's another cheat, easy cheat. Okay, cool. So I've got the right repo. Now what? And I kind of hinted at this a moment ago, but what's the technology that this thing's using? How do I, now that I've cloned it down, what dependencies do I need? What version of Node or .NET might I need to install? How do I, as a developer, what command do I just run to get this thing going? And although it goes a little bit out of documentation, ideally you want it to be one command so that you can clone the repo, run npm dev and get going in a perfect world. And then I think in an organization, as most open source projects do, like, what's the next steps? How do I get help? So who do I talk to, or where's further documentation? As well as maybe development practices if they're specific to that repo. Okay, so now I've cloned this thing down, I've got it working, and it started up, and I want to make a change, but why? Like, it's using this weird library. Why has that happened? And this is something I mentioned earlier. I can't tell you the number of times that I've joined a project or someone new has joined the project and they question every decision that's been made in the past. So this goes a little bit out of pure documentation and talks about architecture. So the purpose of documentation is to communicate things to people, ideas. And in a software arena, documentation that communicates the architecture and the decisions of that led to the architecture is really important to avoid going around in circles and questioning everything. Because sometimes it's important, but usually it's not helpful. So Markdown, and I should have mentioned before, all the readmes are Markdown readmes. So they're very lightweight text with this very basic formatting. Don't get too fancy. So we'll use Markdown again to do what are called architecture decision records, or Markdown architecture decision records. Those convey a few things. Basically these 4 things. What was the problem we were trying to solve? What options were considered? Because that's the second question that people ask, like, why are you using React? Well, what about Vue, for example? Hypothetical example. So if you say, we chose React because we evaluated Vue and Angular and React, and we made the decision to use React, and the reason was X, Y, Z, because our team knows React and we don't want to learn the others, even though they may be better. Not open to discussion right now. I always find when I use examples that someone will be like, yeah, but Vue's actually better. That's not the point. And I think that highlights the benefit of this. It's in the context of this project, in the business that we're working in, these decisions have been made. And so it's to try and keep people on track and not re-questioning everything. Again, use a template. Here is an example of one which I put together recently for our organisation, because we have previously not done mobile app development, and we've had a few projects come up recently where we wanted to help clients with mobile apps. And so in this one, the context, I can share the slides, but I'll give you the TLDR of the context. It was basically, as an organisation that does React front-end development quite heavily and .NET back-end development, who now wants to also do some mobile apps, how can we best do that, and what product should we use? And so we decided on React Native because it aligns most with our skill sets, and even though we have heavy .NET experience, which is covered further on, we didn't feel like Xamarin or Maui were mature enough or flexible enough for what we needed, so that's the decision. And that's been good. I actually was able to send a link to someone the other day when they were like, why are we doing React Native? So that's an example of what an architecture decision record could look like. And over time, in projects, you will build up more and more of these. And so the simple solution to that is to create a folder, number them, and create an index file that points to them. It's very unexciting. Also with Markdown, if these are in your repo, they get rendered nicely when you browse through GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever. So, okay, now I understand all the decisions of the past, but I want to add some cool new features to this thing. How can I make that decision? And you know, there are a few options. One would be just make it yourself and go for it. But if you're in an organisation working with other developers or even other teams of developers, it's probably best if you could work, you know, in a way that is in alignment with other people, and that you're not just coming up with ideas on your own. So, architectural principles, again, slightly outside of documentation, but a reason to document is to capture architectural principles. And the reason that these are important is because they remove the need for a team to always go and ask someone else for permission or to make a decision about something. For example, if there are common patterns in your organisation that, you know, we always use React, or we always use this pattern for development, like we like to use Entity Framework, or we like to. That's probably an architecture decision. A principle might be that we use an ORM. Like we'd rather use an ORM to talk to our database than to talk to a database directly, or have loosely coupled services, those sorts of things that are principles. It means that teams can make decisions without having to go to an architect or an architecture board to have the holy stamp put on their idea. And so when you are making decisions in a team or a team of teams, it's always good to look for the things that could or should be a principle. So it helps people not be reliant on an architecture team or a manager to make a decision. And so what is an architectural principle? It's basically comes up with these 4 things. So it's got a name, ideally a nice short name. So we value loosely coupled components, for example. And then a statement that explains what that means with rationale, and maybe there's some side effects of that. Like, we've chosen to do things in a particular way, but we know there are downsides to that. Here are the implications. And I guess with principles, they're kind of like rules, but they can be broken. But it's a good starting point. So by default, most of your decisions should be able to fall within the principle. And then if you need to deviate from it, then that's when you have the conversation. Okay, so that's great. This is all well and good. I now know how to download, or what this repo does. I know how to get started, so I can write some code. I know why these people made all these decisions that I disagree with, but that's cool because they've captured the reasons, and I know how to add to it. But maybe I've kind of got a front-end repo and maybe there's a database over here and some infrastructure stuff and a couple of back-end services. How does it all fit together? So this is where we get into some diagramming, and a picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say. Traditional approaches. So in the original version of this, I was like, we don't need to draw pictures anymore. We'll just use code and we'll render pictures. But someone raised a good point about things like a Scally draw, and this actually there's a plugin for this. You can run it in the browser, or it can run in VS Code and possibly other IDEs. It's pretty cool. Makes your diagrams look like sketch art, which is kind of cool. But if you're just needing to quickly draw a diagram, this alleviates that problem I mentioned earlier about learning a new language, a markup language, to create diagrams. Everyone knows how to use PowerPoint and drawing tools, and this is just a drawing tool. It just saves stuff in a JSON format, which can be version controlled a little easier. Slightly easier, but it's not perfect. It has symbol libraries for common cloud platforms and things like that. So that's a good starting point. However, I think some code is also worth 1,000 words, and maybe 1,000 words of code is worth 1,000 diagrams? I don't know. Anyway, so I think I'm trying to draw that analogy out too far. So Plant UML, there are a bunch of markup languages or domain-specific languages around for doing diagrams from code or diagrams from text. Plant UML was the most powerful and first one that I stumbled upon, and so there are a bunch of others out there. Mermaid's another really good example, and there's one called Croaky, and the list goes on. So this is what I'm going to talk about predominantly today, but feel free to use whatever you feel like. I'm not opinionated about it. This is just what's worked for me, and I've inflicted it on all my teammates. So sorry, guys. So it's a text-based diagramming tool. I'll skip over these quickly and get to some examples. It's extensible. There are libraries, so you can get icons that match AWS and Azure and anything else you might need. It works in all of our common development tools. I don't know if there's a Visual Studio plugin for it, because I don't use Visual Studio anymore, but there is. All the JetBrains products have it. VS Code, you can use Vim, anything you want, anything that can edit a text file. You can also embed these diagrams straight into a markup file. So in your normal document, you can have markup, and then a code block that is a diagram in text, and it will actually render it into a full image as part of the markup, which is kind of nice. So this one, I'll skip over the details of the C4 model, but it's a super useful thing, and I'd encourage everyone to read up on this and learn a little bit more about it. It's a simplified way of representing architectural diagrams. They give you, up in the top right there, 6 boxes, 7 boxes. You can have a person, which is like an actor in your system. Components and containers and systems and databases, they don't give you many options. And that's the beauty of this approach with all of the stuff I'm talking about today. You don't get hung up on the details, too much of the details. And so it simplifies the process of explaining diagrams. And the idea of C4 is that you start with this high-level context diagram, which is, here's my system, here's a user, they talk to a web app that talks to a back-end system. And it's that abstract. I'll show you an example in a minute. And I've used this approach to talk to executives and steercos and bigwig people in organisations, and they gave the feedback that it was the best architecture diagram they'd ever seen, which shocked me because they paid a lot of people a lot of money to be architects. But it was the simplicity, because for them they were putting up millions of dollars for these projects, and they could see, yeah, so that's where our customer interacts with this system and that system. They don't need to know all the details. They don't need to know that it's using SSL to talk between the load balancer and the blah, blah, blah. Like, that stuff's important, but not in the first diagram. And it also gives you that cognitive simplicity, I guess, that you can look at a high level and go, right, understand that, and then drill down to the next level, which is the container level. And so that's where you start to break up some of those components, the systems. So I shouldn't say components, it's a specific term here, but what the systems actually comprise of. When I use the C4 model, I rarely actually do levels 3 and 4. I don't tend to need to get into that level of detail for the work I do. Other people may find different uses. But it's great. And you can do this in Excalidraw, you can do it on a whiteboard. The C4 model isn't actually a diagramming tool, it's more of a methodology for how you do your architecture diagrams. So definitely read up on that. And I'm going to use that to start my sort of demonstration of what plant UML looks like. So this is the diagramming language I mentioned a couple of slides ago. So on the left-hand side, you can see, and hopefully this text is okay at the back. Sorry if it isn't, but it's all right, awesome. You maybe just have really good eyes. So the idea is, on the left-hand side, there's markup, and you can indicate some things. So I've got 2 people have been specified, so you can see my app user and my gift recipient. And then I've defined my containers. So as I mentioned earlier, like, there's a bunch of services and APIs and databases and storage accounts and stuff underneath here. But when I'm communicating how this app works or what this system does to the founder of the business or an investor or someone, even a developer who's just joined and wants to know how this all hangs together, we don't care about all that detail. It's like, yep, there's an app user and they interact with the app and the code redemption site, whatever that is. And we can get into that later. So yeah, again, you can see it's really simple. And then, so you define some objects up here and then rel relationships. One of the things that will instantly annoy you with plant UML is the lack of ability to control the layout. It'll drive you nuts because that isn't the focus of the language. It's about conveying messages or relationships between items in your architecture. So if I get time for it, I can maybe do a demo at the end. Like this piece of code here rendered to that just now, but if I added another object in, it might shuffle it all around and the users might end up at the bottom of the diagram and stuff like that. It's a little frustrating, but you'll get used to it, and I'd encourage you to kind of let go of trying to control it. In this case, there is a rel R that I've used here, which is forcing my app users to, or my 2 users to be side by side. Because I wanted them to be. It works sometimes, it doesn't always work. Anyway, so then this is an example of a totally different system that I've worked in, and this is the next level down, so this is the container diagram. So you can see now it's showing a lot more detail. I've got some system boundaries there. I've labeled some of the arrows between things, and I think with these sorts of diagrams, the lines are almost more important than, or as important as the boxes. So how do things communicate, or what is the relationship? But you can see that the structure is very similar. It's, you know, I've got a couple of extra tags now, system boundaries and containers. And then down here, I've got relationships and bi-directional relationships, just to force the arrows to appear in the right places. But you can see it's quite a simplistic language, visual language, to see how things talk to each other. If you've got a really complicated system, the trick is to use the higher level diagram, like this one, to show the big components and the systems within your system, or the containers, and then use a series of these smaller diagrams to sort of zoom into each of those. Don't try to put everything on one diagram, because the code will be horrible for starters, and the layout with these lines will just be insane. And that's usually an indication of too much stuff on your diagram. If you're getting annoyed by the number of lines, it's maybe an opportunity to break things down a bit differently. So this is, I guess C4 is a way to show the relationships between things, high-level architecture of your apps and solutions. But PlantUML offers a bunch of other options or capabilities as well. So I'm just going to skim through a few of these. This is, I don't even know, I called it an architecture diagram. It's not really, but I had this Docker Compose file in a repo, and it stood up however many services that is, like six, yes. And I wanted to convey how do these things all talk to each other, so that in my README it was clear when someone stood up the Docker file or the Docker Compose file, they knew what was talking to what, and that traffic is like a load balancer, so that I could have put a user at the top. All of the traffic flowed through that service. So this is an example, and you can see again, if I'm not in the way, it's really just a word with little boxes around it and an arrow. That's another way to represent an architecture through text. And it renders into that nice, slightly pixelated diagram. And that took a couple of minutes. And then every time, if I go and update my Docker file now and add a new service, I just go and add another line to that text file, and it gets rendered out to documentation. So there's no friction once I've learned the basic language. Again, and some people in the audience may recognize this diagram. So this is a sequence diagram that we used at a client to help communicate a very complicated handshake process between various different systems that were talking to each other. Up to that moment, the teams had been, it was multiple teams working on multiple software and hardware systems, and up until sort of the point that we started doing this, we were struggling to trace or to get the messaging flow quite right. So we started off on a whiteboard and kind of brainstormed it together, but then built out a sequence diagram. So this now lives in the repo with the code, and every time, hopefully, every time the code gets changed, someone will update the sequence diagram. The real sequence diagram is like way, way longer, but it didn't fit on a slide. So you can see there's another diagram type, and another way to convey complex concepts in a purchasing process or something like that, where you've got multiple systems that messages flow through. So now you can convey that through a diagram quite easily. Everyone's seen an entity relationship diagram. You can do these in PlantUML. I feel like once you go past a couple of tables though, it's nightmarish and I wouldn't recommend it. But if you wanted to communicate maybe a new change or something specific, it's handy to be able to model something and quickly create a diagram. And then deployment diagrams. So as I mentioned, it supports a bunch of symbol libraries, and I don't know why my images are so blurry, but anyway. So yeah, this is just an example of a slightly complex AWS deployment that we had where it was flowing through 6 or 7 systems. And so that documentation now sits in the README of this particular project, so that when someone clones it down, they know all of the hops that the messages are taking to get from the front end to the back end. There's 3 or 4 more boxes to the right that didn't fit on the slide. So yeah, I guess my point here is there are a bunch of different capabilities within things like Plant UML. Cool. And you can model these diagrams through text, keep them in your repo, and pick the right diagram type. If you go to plantuml.com, I think it is, they've got all of the types. Pick the ones that suit the message you're trying to convey to your users or your teammates. So, which brings me on to a good point. Now that you've got it in a repo, what if you're starting to build up a bunch of files? Maybe you've got your README and a folder of docs, and maybe you could have user documentation or developer API documentation in here now. Like, does it just live in the repo? Well, no. So there's a bunch of projects. Again, these are the ones that I've recently used, but if you have preferences, there are 1,000 others that will render Markdown files into other formats. So MakeDocs and MakeDocs Material is one, I think it's a Python project that renders Markdown into a static HTML site. The static HTML site actually has JavaScript searchability, so you can build like a Gitbook style website using this just from your Markdown documents very easily. If you want a little bit more sophistication, you can use something like Dockersaurus, and that's based on React, so you can actually build custom React components into there if you wanted to, but I'd advise against it. There's Vue-based ones and all sorts of language-based ones. And then you can, depending on the output of those, some of them are server-based and some of them are just static sites. So with MakeDocs, I actually have an internal website that I work on at work for all of my practices that I do, and that's actually just a bunch of Markdown files that get rendered to static HTML and then deployed onto an Azure static website, and that's it. And I guess that takes me maybe to my next point. Yeah, so that's actually part of my CI/CD process. So when I make a change to any of my Markdown or any of the files in there, I just push it up to our Git repo and it gets rebuilt, the static site gets deployed, and it's done, it's updated. And now non-technical team members can go to that website because it's just whatever, a URL that they can go to, and it looks like a pretty website and it's consumable. So that's great if you want to share it wider than just a few of your teammates. The other option is, and we've been experimenting a little bit around this for doing reports and things, you can render Markdown to PDFs and docx or a multitude of formats using things like Pandoc. So you can do things like if you've got if you're in an organization that actually needs the documentation to be in a Word document, you could still do it in Markdown. You could create a Word document template that has all of your styles and stuff in it, and then use Pandoc to like transcode it over to a Word doc. So I've done that in the past. I feel at some point there's diminishing returns on that though, because you end up fighting Word too much, but it's a cool idea. And then that's just the command line there. So you Pandoc the template file, where you want it to go, and the style you want to use, and the folder of documents, and then it pulls all of your Markdown together into a Word doc. And then the other thing, which if you have lots of friends and you work in a large organization, there's developer platforms like Backstage that support this sort of thing, MakeDocs and Markdown documentation, as well as Plant UML. And Backstage is this whole platform that lets you publish all of your documentation as well as metadata. It'll pull stuff out of repos. It does a whole lot more than just documentation, but it can be, you can put your documentation in there. So then you've got this whole platform where your developers can go to search for the repos they're looking for, to find the contracts or the APIs that things are using to talk to each other, and then read the documentation that you have all been writing in your repos now. So yeah, this works for single projects all the way up to large enterprises. So it's kind of cool. And all just using Markdown and a bit of structure. So I guess just to wrap it up, and I'll open up to questions after this, but this is basically the key takeaways is to keep things simple and try to use the text-based approach, because it forces you to keep things simple when you don't have the option. And then focus on the content and not the presentation. And yeah, my other one that I've mentioned a few times is to minimize the licensing constraints. But it's really minimize friction. If there's a reason that people aren't doing documentation, and yeah, this is the slide to take a photo if you want to. But I can share my slides. I'll put them on my website as well. Yeah, like, why are people not doing documentation when it helps us so much? And there's usually a reason. And if licensing or security or something is the reason, then try to fix that problem. And yeah, this is more just for a summary for people who are taking a photo, but that's the sort of the problem and the solution for each of those things that I've gone through. So I won't reiterate that. I'd rather open up to questions if there are any.
How does it scale across like multiple repositories? Like, so you've got 5 different projects all running and you want to get all your documentation into one thing. Do you end up having 5 doc sites for each or a doc site for each project, or do the tools have a way that you can compile them all into one set of documentation to make it easy to, well, discoverable?
Yeah. Yes, I guess you can choose. So the tools by default generally won't solve that problem for you, but the Make Docs does have I can't remember what it's called, but they have got a module or a way that you can have multiple repos, but it basically clones all the repos into subfolders, and then it can render that into a single big site. If you need something more sophisticated, like that Backstage thing can do it, but it's also massive investment, like you wouldn't do it for 5 projects. The other way that I've done it is, well, and I guess the other option is to put your code, your documentation in a repo on its own. But I would kind of advise against that for the reason that you don't put unit tests in the repo on their own, because they diverge from the code that you're working on and all of that. Or, writing scripts to pull things together. Yeah, it depends.
Great. I still 15 seconds from you.
Yep.
We have a sponsor, the Sizzle, which awards the first question maker with a free subscription to the newsletter, The Sizzle. So congratulations to the winner. You're welcome. Thank you, Shaw. Question coming?
Thanks for that. I'm personally a big fan of this kind of documentation approach. In the organizations that I've worked for where I've tried to sell it to the team, some of the pushbacks that I've had is that they don't like the idea of the architecture being inside our repositories, and also that they don't like generally the styling of it. They need things to be colorful and pretty, which is generally fair enough. How would you comment on that, and do you have any suggestions from a styling point of view as well?
Yeah, I'll tackle the styling one first because it's easy. It's going to be an argument that people make. I'd go back to what I had said, like what's the point of the documentation? If it's an architecture diagram that's going, I don't know, in an annual report to somewhere, maybe that's important, but then get some designers to, or, tidy it up for that purpose. I think that detracts from that's friction that's going to stop developers from updating the documentation. So I'd say try to avoid that problem. On the other question, and I should have remembered it.
Security.
Oh yeah, right. So security. I mean, there is an argument to be made that if your architecture is if the architecture spans more than just that one project, maybe it should be in another repo. I'd still use the same techniques, but maybe have overall architecture elsewhere. From a security point of view, I would question why that is needed. Why do they feel that their architecture is a security issue? And if their security is dependent on their architecture being secret, then that's probably an issue in itself. I don't know if that answers it. I kind of just avoided the question. Yeah, it's a tough one. And I guess it's always a discussion about what's the real driver behind that concern.
Great, perfect. We don't have much time for another question, but I know that Shaw is going to be more than happy to have a conversation afterwards. So please, a big round of applause for him. It's a great talk.